5 ships, creaking hulls, battered sails. Just another Tuesday in the deadly game of 17th century global trade. Or so it seemed. April 6, 1652, Table Bay. What looked like routine merchant vessels dropping anchor was actually something far more explosive. The Dutch East India Company wasn't just stopping for water and repairs. They were about to flip the script on an entire continent. While other European powers saw the Cape of Good Hope as a cursed stretch of coastline, a ship-killing nightmare that had to be endured, the Dutch saw a chessboard, and they were about to make the move that would checkmate the future. Jan van Riebeeck stepped onto that beach with a secret. 5 reasons, 5 calculated strategies that would transform a desolate shore into the foundation of a nation in his journal. He scribbled words that would echo through centuries. Today we plant more than flag. We plant the future itself. What he didn't know, those 5 reasons would unleash forces that would reshape Africa forever. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is the Missing History Records. The establishment of any colonial outpost is easily dismissed as inevitable expansion. Ships arrive, flags are planted, settlements grow. It all seems so predictable in hindsight. But in examining the Dutch decision to permanently settle the Cape, there's a deeper truth lurking beneath the surface. This wasn't random imperial ambition driven by glory or gold. This was calculated survival. By 1652, the Dutch East India Company faced a crisis that threatened to unravel their entire Eastern Empire. Their ships were dying. Not from cannon fire or storms alone, but from something far more insidious. The simple, brutal mathematics of distance. The voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia stretched 16,000 miles across some of the world's most dangerous waters. Ships that departed Holland with crews of 200 healthy men often limped into the East Indies, with barely half that number still breathing. Scurvy was claiming more Dutch sailors than all their enemies combined. Storms were shattering masts faster than they could be replaced. And at the exact midpoint of this deadly journey lay a wind-swept cape that offered salvation, if only the Dutch could figure out how to use it. But there was a problem. The Cape of Good Hope was nobody's land. No European power had claimed it, no permanent settlement existed, and the local Khoikhoi people traded only when they felt like it. Ships could anchor in Table Bay and hope for the best, but hope was a poor strategy for an empire built on precision. The English were growing bolder, sending their own expeditions eastward. The French were eyeing the spice routes with hungry eyes. Even the Portuguese, who had discovered the route, were beginning to reconsider their neglect of the strategic position. The Dutch monopoly on eastern trade, worth millions of guilders annually, hung by a thread. Every month they delayed gave their competitors another chance to establish their own foothold. Every ship that foundered at the Cape was a fortune lost forever. But the stakes went deeper than mere commerce. This was about the future of European power in the East. Whoever controlled the Cape controlled the gateway to Asia's riches. Whoever could solve the deadly mathematics of the Eastern voyage would dominate global trade for centuries. The Dutch had built their entire identity around being the world's greatest maritime traders. They had defied the Spanish Empire, outmaneuvered the Portuguese, and were now locked in deadly competition with the English. Failure at the Cape meant more than lost profits. It meant the end of Dutch dominance on the world stage. In 1652, the Dutch faced a critical choice that would reshape not just their empire, but the destiny of an entire continent. 5 specific reasons converged to make the Cape essential rather than optional. 5 strategic calculations that would echo through centuries of transformation, conflict, and change. Why did the Dutch choose this particular moment? What forces made permanent settlement the only viable option? And how did their 5 reasons set in motion the birth of what will become South Africa? Stay with me as we uncover the 5 compelling reasons behind one of history's most consequential landings. In the middle of the 17th century, the world's oceans had become highways of empire, and no one traveled them more successfully then the Dutch. At the center of this vast commercial web stood the VOC, the Verenigd Oost-Indisch Company, the Dutch East India Company, not merely a trading concern, but a floating empire with powers that rivaled sovereign nations. By 1652, the VOC commanded nearly 6,000 ships totaling 600,000 tons, with over 50,000 sailors under its flag. It minted coins, commanded armies, made laws, and waged wars. From Amsterdam and Rotterdam, their ships carved a path south through the Atlantic, around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope, and east into the contested waters of the Indian Ocean. Their destination, the Spice Islands of what is now Indonesia, where nutmeg, cloves, and pepper promised riches beyond imagination. But this 16,000-mile journey was brutal. Ships could be lost to storms, scurvy, pirates, or simply the relentless exhaustion of months at sea. And at the exact halfway point of this perilous voyage stood one fateful landmark, the Cape of Good Hope. Here, every VOC captain faced the same dilemma, a chance to repair and resupply, but in wild country with no European infrastructure, no guaranteed safety, and uncertain relations with the local Khoi people. The VOC's dominance of the spice trade hung on solving this problem. They needed more than luck and favorable winds. They needed an anchor. The first reason the Dutch landed permanently at the Cape didn't come by grand design. It came wrapped in disaster. On the 25th of March, 1647, just after 5 p.m., as the sun dipped toward the Atlantic, the sea revealed its secrets to the VOC in the most brutal way possible. The Dutch East Indiaman ship, Nova Haarlem, wrecked off the coast of Table Bay. Her wooden hull splintered against the hidden rocks. In an instant, what was supposed to be a routine stopover on the long voyage to the east became a battle for survival. The crew, bruised, soaked, and shaken, managed to scramble ashore. What faced them was a hostile land, dry, windswept, and to European eyes, unforgiving. They were stranded at the edge of the known world, hundreds of miles from any Dutch outpost. But instead of chaos, something remarkable began to unfold. These sailors, men trained to navigate oceans and command ships, now had to become farmers, foragers, and diplomats. With limited supplies, they began hunting local game, gathering wild plants, and, crucially, interacting with the indigenous Khoi people. Trade developed. Beads, copper, and metal tools were exchanged for cattle and milk. The Khoi, wary but curious, offered the Dutch something invaluable, a chance to survive. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. The crew built makeshift shelters using shipwreck timber. They explored the surroundings, taking notes of the soil, the water sources, the local vegetation. They observed the seasons, tracked the winds, and slowly came to a groundbreaking conclusion. The Cape was not just survivable, it was fertile. It could feed them. It could house them. It could, in time, sustain an entire settlement. One sailor recorded, "We found the soil rich in places, the climate tolerable, and the natives willing to trade their cattle for our metal goods. What we thought would be our grave became our garden." This wasn't just a tale of survival. It was a revelation, a living, breathing experiment, played out far from the halls of power in Amsterdam. Months later, when rescue finally arrived, the crew didn't simply bring their battered bodies back to Europe. They brought something far more valuable: reports, maps, and journals. Proof, evidence that the Cape of Good Hope was not just a waypoint for weary ships. It could be a base, a colony, a lifeline. In Amsterdam, the directors of the VOC leaned forward in their chairs. These men, always calculating, always searching for strategic advantage, saw the opportunity laid bare, a place to repair ships, rest tired crews, resupply with fresh provisions, and control the gateway between East and West. The idea of a permanent station at the Cape, once seen as too costly, too risky, now shimmered with possibility. The misfortune of the Nova Harlem had revealed something no map or merchant could have predicted. The Cape was not just habitable, it was profitable. And if it was profitable, it was worth controlling. But this accidental discovery was just the beginning. The VOC's second reason for permanent settlement was far more calculated. The second reason the Dutch chose to settle permanently at the Cape wasn't born from shipwreck or accident. It was written in the very lines of the earth. It was geography, ruthless, inescapable geography. In 1652, there was only one viable sea route to the spice-rich East Indies, a treacherous arc around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. There were no shortcuts, no Suez Canal, no alternative passages. Every European empire chasing Asian wealth, Portuguese, English, French, Dutch, had around this corner of the continent, and that made the Cape not just a stopover, but the strategic choke point of the world. The Portuguese had found the route first in 1488, but they had never truly exploited the Cape. They treated it as an obstacle, something to endure, not embrace. Their focus remained fixed on India, Mozambique, and beyond. But the Dutch thought differently. With a merchant's mind and a strategist's eye, they saw opportunity where others saw hardship. By 1650, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was dominating nearly 60% of all European trade with Asia. Their ships stretched from Amsterdam to Batavia, from Ceylon to Nagasaki. But cracks were forming in their monopoly. The English East India Company was growing bolder. The French were eyeing the spice routes. Even the Danes, though small, were probing eastward. The VOC needed a way to protect its dominance, and the Cape was the key. Control the Cape, and you control the flow of goods between Europe and Asia, not by building a wall, but by building a harbor. A fortified settlement at Table Bay would serve several purposes. First, it would provide fresh water, meat, and repairs for passing Dutch ships, increasing survival rates on the long voyage. Second, it would deny those same advantages to rival nations. And third, and most important, it would act as a naval base, a military outpost from which Dutch influence could radiate across the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The VOC, though a trading company on paper, had powers few corporations in history have wielded. It could raise armies, mint coins, sign treaties, even wage war. For such an empire, geography was more than topography. It was destiny. To understand just how vital the Cape was, imagine the globe not as land and sea, but as trade routes, like arteries across a body. Ships are blood cells, and the Cape of Good Hope is the valve. If the Dutch could open or close that valve, they could decide who lived, who profited, and who failed. In 1652, Jan van Riebeeck arrived at the Cape with 3 ships, a handful of men, and a clear mission to establish a permanent Dutch station. But behind his small fleet lay a much larger vision, the defense of empire. Years later, van Riebeeck would write in his journal, "He who commands the Cape commands a route to India, and he who commands the route to India commands a wealth of the East." It was more than ambition. It was strategy sharpened into certainty. The Cape was no longer just a landmark on the way to somewhere else. It was a point. The third reason the Dutch established a permanent settlement at the Cape wasn't gold or glory. It was survival. A slow, rotting death haunted their ships. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C. Scurvy was a curse of long-distance sailing. It didn't strike like cannon fire. It crept in slowly, invisible at first. Gums bled, teeth loosened, muscles wasted. Sailors became too weak to climb the rigging or pull a rope. Some went mad. Others simply gave up, lie on the deck to die under the open sky. It was an epidemic that killed more men than battle. Ships might leave Amsterdam with 200 healthy crewmen and arrive in Batavia with barely 100 survivors. The loss was more than human. It was economic. Each sailor represented months of training, wages, equipment. When they died, the VOC lost money, time, and power. Worse still, ships arriving with skeleton crews were vulnerable. They couldn't defend themselves. They couldn't load or unload cargo quickly. They couldn't run new missions until fresh men arrived. If they arrived, the VOC knew the answer: fresh food. But they had a problem. It was impossible to carry enough for the months-long voyage around Africa. Salt meat and hard biscuits lasted, but they didn't prevent scurvy. They needed a supply stop, a living pharmacy. That's where the Cape came in. With its Mediterranean climate, reliable rainfall, and fertile soil, the Cape was a natural garden waiting to be planted. The VOC realized this, and Van Riebeeck's orders were clear. Establish a garden that can feed the fleet. This was no casual farming. It was strategy. It was survival. And so began the creation of the company's garden, a landmark that still stands in Cape Town today. Sailors planted cabbage, onions, citrus, and greens. Trenches were dug, compost laid, irrigation planned. Van Riebeeck even kept records of crop yields, because every carrot, every lemon meant lives saved. The garden wasn't just a colonial vanity project. It was a weapon against death. One VOC surgeon wrote, "More men die from scurvy than from all the cannons of our enemies combined. If we can solve this plague with fresh provisions at the Cape, we shall have found the secret to mastering the eastern seas." And that's exactly what they did. With the Cape as their halfway lifeline, Dutch sailors began to survive the long journey. Fleets arrived stronger, ports were better supplied, and VOC profits rose. In the end, it wasn't just guns and ships that built empire. It was gardens. And the Cape became the kitchen and the clinic of the Dutch maritime world. The fourth reason the Dutch planted their flag at the Cape was walking around on four legs. Cattle. To the VOC, they weren't just animals. They were life, wealth, survival, and power. On the long journey to the East Indies, food wasn't just about calories. It was about strength. And strength came from fresh meat. Preserved meat, salted beef, smoked pork was an option, but it was expensive, often spoiled in the heat, and nutritionally poor. Sailors grew sick, weak, or worse. What the VOC needed was live animals to be slaughtered fresh, piece by piece, day by day. The Khoi of the Cape had exactly what the Dutch needed. For over 1,000 years, the Khoi people had grazed vast herds of cattle and sheep across the Cape's rugged plains. These weren't European animals. They were lean, heat-adapted, drought-resistant. They could walk long distances. They could survive harsh terrain. They were perfect for provisioning ships that might spend months at sea. When Van Riebeeck arrived in 1652, he quickly understood the potential. He wrote, "The natives possess cattle in great abundance, fat and healthy beasts that could feed our ships for the entire voyage ahead. If we could secure a steady supply of these animals, we should never want for fresh meat again." But there was a catch. The Khoi were willing to trade, but only occasionally and only on their own terms. For them, cattle weren't just food. They were wealth, status, identity. A man's herd was his bank account, his legacy. And the Khoi didn't sell that easily. Still, the Dutch knew what was possible. A permanent settlement could transform occasional exchanges into regular trade. Instead of waiting for a friendly encounter, the VOC could build stockyards, plan transfers, and guarantee every passing ship fresh meat. The logistics were simple: buy cattle alive, keep them on board, and slaughter as needed. But behind the simplicity was a deeper ambition. Controlling the livestock trade meant influencing the entire Khoi economy. The Dutch brought copper, iron tools, beads, and later alcohol and tobacco. In return, they took cattle. Over time, they shifted the balance of power. The Khoi needed the Dutch to access goods they now desired. It was commerce, but it was also control. One VOC official reportedly said, "Let them come to us for iron and tobacco, and we shall take their herds one by one." This was economic warfare, disguised as trade. The Khoi became suppliers, but they also became dependent. And slowly, the Dutch began to push for more cattle, more trade, and eventually more land to graze Dutch-owned animals. Tensions simmered. At first, it was a negotiation over cattle prices, trade frequency, and trust. But soon, it would become confrontation. Two economic systems, one communal and pastoral, the other capitalist and extractive, had begun to clash. The livestock lifeline that fed Dutch ships would soon ignite the first wars on African soil between European settlers and indigenous herders. But in 1652, that future hadn't come yet. For now, the Dutch saw cattle not just as meat, but as momentum, a mobile, renewable, living supply chain that could power their empire from Amsterdam to Batavia. And the Cape was their butcher's shop. The fifth and final reason the Dutch settled permanently at the Cape was carved into the land itself. Wood, trees, timber. To most sailors, the Cape looked dry, windswept, and barren. But just inland, the land changed. In valleys and mountain slopes, forests stood thick with ancient trees, yellowwood, stinkwood, ironwood. These weren't decorative. They were strategic. In an age when wooden ships were the lifelines of empire, timber was everything. It built the hulls, masts, spars, and decks. It patched holes, replaced beams, and brace sails. Without strong wood, ships fell apart. Without ships, there was no empire. The voyage from Amsterdam to the East Indies was brutal. Waves battered the sides, salt rotted the seams, and months of sun and wind left ships creaking and half dead. Many limped into Batavia, needing weeks of repair before they could continue to trade, or even return. The VOC needed a solution, and the Cape offered it. Van Riebeeck quickly recognized the potential. He wrote, "The forest here could supply our entire fleet with timber for masts, planking, and repairs. We shall never again need to limp to Batavia, with vessels barely seaworthy. These indigenous trees were not just common, they were tough. Yellowwood was prized for its straight grain. Stinkwood was dense and resistant to pests. Ironwood, as its name suggests, was nearly indestructible. Better still, these woods were far more durable in tropical waters than European oak, which was often destroyed by marine borers like shipworms. Dutch explorers mapped the locations of these forests in places like Hout Bay and eventually Nisna, and began cutting trails to extract them. It was hard labor. Trees had to be felled by hand, sawn, loaded onto ox carts, and dragged over rough terrain to Table Bay. But the payoff was immense. Soon, the VOC was planning sawmills, workshops, and lumber yards. These weren't temporary fixes. This was infrastructure. A Cape shipyard meant a ship that arrived broken could be made whole again. Masts replaced, hulls patched, decks repaired, all without crossing another ocean. In time, Cape timber will become one of the region's most valuable resources, not just for the VOC, but for Dutch settlers, colonial buildings, and even foreign ships granted emergency repairs. The forest became an extension of the fleet. Few VOC ports offered this luxury. Batavia was too humid. Ceylon's forests were inland and difficult to reach. But the Cape, with its accessible hills and cool climate, was perfect. It was as if the land had been waiting to be harvested. And so, the final argument for a permanent Dutch presence was made not with maps or trade, but with trees, living, growing structures that could keep the VOC's empire afloat. What gold was to Spain, what spices were to Portugal, timber was to the Dutch. Quietly, steadily, the forests of the Cape fueled the engines of one of history's most powerful maritime machines. These 5 reasons, the shipwreck revelation, the strategic choke point, the scurvy solution, the livestock lifeline and the timber treasure, converged in 1652 to make the Dutch landing at the Cape not just possible, but inevitable. What began as a practical decision to establish a refreshment station became something far more profound: the birth of a new society. The men who landed with Van Riebeeck came as servants of the VOC, but the Cape transformed them into something else. By 1662, when Van Riebeeck departed, the colony had grown from a handful of company officials to a community of 35 free burghers, 134 company employees, and 180 enslaved people. These weren't just Dutch merchants anymore. They were becoming Africans. The 5 strategic reasons that brought them to the Cape created dynamics that would reshape the continent. The search for fresh provisions led to the establishment of farms that pushed deeper into Khoi territory. The need for livestock created economic relationships that gradually became relationships of domination. The desire to control the strategic shipping lane led to the construction of fortifications that declared permanent European presence on African soil. What the VOC intended as a simple business decision became the foundation of centuries of conflict, cultural exchange, and transformation. The 5 reasons that brought the Dutch to the Cape in 1652 would echo through the Great Trek: the mineral discoveries, the Anglo-Boer Wars, and ultimately the complex society that would become modern South Africa. When those 5 ships dropped anchor in Table Bay on April 6, 1652, no one aboard could have imagined they were laying the foundations of a future nation. The Dutch East India Company had 5 practical reasons for establishing a refreshment station: learning from the lessons of shipwreck survivors, securing a strategic choke point, solving the deadly problem of scurvy, establishing a supply of livestock, and tapping into the timber treasures of the Cape. But history has a habit of transforming practical decisions into turning points, of taking small steps and casting long shadows. What began as a logistical solution became the ignition point of a colony. A trade station turned into a settlement. A settlement became a society. And that society would evolve violently, beautifully, tragically, into the South Africa we know today. The 5 ships that carried Van Riebeeck and his men to the Cape didn't just bring supplies. They brought intentions, ideologies, ambitions. They carried the seeds of ownership, of displacement, of encounter. They carried empire. The reasons the Dutch landed at the Cape in 1652 weren't just about trade, or even power. They were about the moment when European ambition collided with African reality, when need created presence, when presence became permanence, and when permanence reshaped an entire continent. From those 5 reasons, everything else followed. And perhaps the Cape was never truly a waypoint. Perhaps it was always a destination. The story of the Cape is far from over. In our next episode, we dive into the year 1657, when the Dutch East India Company set its first settlers free. Who were these first free burghers? And how did their freedom shape the colony's future? If you're fascinated by the moment's history almost forgot, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to Missing History Records and rediscover the stories that shaped our world.